Les gens, les boxeurs qui ont un style très agressif, ils ont ces t-shirts un peu à la Tyson, là, des shorts de cours, un petit
When I say you must obey, just like the both of you touch my head.
Et là, Maïva, ce sont
Ouais, Manu le crochet. Magnifique shot.
Ah, c'est un vrai coup au corps.
Et ouais, le crochet au foie, il a touché.
Là, c'est un vrai coup au corps.
Pendant Bigouan,
Ouais,
encore un
pas
rouge.
au corps.
Allez, très belle dur là, qui a arrêté.
Oui, forcément, elle remet un genou au sol.
Et elle regarde son point. Ça va dans tous les sens, la part des deux boxeuses. Et tout ça par du bon point. Elle a touché encore un nouveau point. Elle a du mal, Viviane. Elle a du mal à récupérer.
Okay, we'll start with this. Daniel Jacobs and Gabriel Rosado have agreed to fight on November 27th in a headlined bout on DAZN. Sources tell The Athletic Box will be Jacobs' second bout at 168 pounds. As iDeck Boxing first reported, DAZN pushed for John Ryder as the opponent. And, you know, a lot of times, a lot of these different channels out there in the YouTube boxing community, I don't think they gave DAZN a fair shake. A lot of snap judgments and criticisms over what fights were happening on the platform. As far as I'm concerned, DAZN has been value for money for the most part. Just the World Boxing Super Series in and of itself has provided hours upon hours of entertaining high-level boxing. But when it comes to a fight like this,
it's hard to get behind it.
I'm not overly critical in the least bit as far as what fights have been taking place on DAZN. I reiterate, for the most part, it really has been value for money. The World Boxing Super Series, Matchroom's Fight Camp Series.
And what cards Matchroom staged before that?
Matchroom really has given us some memorable moments on the DAZN platform with what fights they have staged there. The Hooker versus Ramirez unification match, Anthony Joshua's shock defeat to Andy Ruiz and his rise,
his revenge,
reclaiming his heavyweight world titles, the rise of Jessica McCaskill from 140-pound champion to unified champion to undisputed welterweight champion. Some memorable moments, some great fights really have been delivered to us, the fans, by Matchroom and DAZN. But looking at a fight like this isn't a fight that needs to happen. There's nothing memorable about Jacobs versus Rosado. These are two guys who really do need to be fighting other people. This fight ain't gonna move the needle.
It's just not.
There's just no intrigue. Daniel Jacobs has already fought at a level to where a fighter like Gabe Rosado is tell dem age for Daniel Jacobs. He doesn't get anything out of fighting and beating this guy. This is the kind of guy who, God bless him, is an ideal opponent for a Jaime Munguia, who is earning his stripes as a middleweight in the middleweight division. An ideal opponent for top-ranked Puerto Rican prospect in the super middleweight division, Edgar Berlanga. Those engagements make a lot more sense than Rosado versus Jacobs because Gabriel Rosado has enough experience that a fight with a Berlanga or a fight with a Munguia could actually be compelling, could actually be competitive.
Since those guys aren't as experienced as he is.
Win, lose, or draw, Gabriel Rosado has been in there with some of the best and brightest fighters anywhere at or around 160 pounds. So Munguia versus Rosado or Berlanga versus Rosado, those fights make a bit more sense than Jacobs versus Rosado. What the hell does Jacobs have to prove to Gabriel Rosado? What the hell does Daniel Jacobs get out of fighting and beating Gabriel Rosado?
And this is supposed to be the headliner.
Let me tell you something. Canelo Alvarez was supposed to be a big part of DAZN's bottom line in this part of the world. That guy was supposed to be a big part of their selling point, their marketability. And in all likelihood, based on what's going on, that legal battle, that lawsuit, that guy isn't going to fight this year. So you can't afford to spend time and money on fights like Jacobs versus Rosado. There are two super middleweight champions on that same side of the street with Daniel Jacobs, and he should be fighting either one of them, either Billy Joe Saunders or Callum Smith, because they ain't fighting each other, right?
Right.
We saw what opponent options they've got lined up for Billy Joe Saunders. Martin Murray, Rocky Fielding, a John Ryder rematch that no one was asking for, Fedor Chudinov. It's pretty obvious that Billy Joe Saunders ain't going to be unifying titles with Callum Smith, and if those two world champions aren't unifying with each other, what excuse is there for them to not fight Daniel Jacobs?
They ought to be fighting each other or fighting him.
Billy Joe Saunders especially. I mean, when's the last time Billy Joe Saunders fought someone with a pulse? Look at his last 3 fights. Adamu, Isufi, Kosaris, and what are your new set of options? Martin Murray, Fedor Chudinov, Rocky Fielding, John Ryder? Give me a break.
Yeah, we just talked about this.
DAZN needs fights that are going to move the needle. And Billy Joe Saunders versus any one of those 4 names, any one of those 4 guys, that ain't going to do it. Daniel Jacobs versus Gabriel Rosado, that ain't going to do it either.
That fight doesn't need to happen.
For Christ's sake, the least you can do is match Daniel Jacobs against Mario Cazares, the guy who just dished out that shock upset loss to Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. I think that Daniel Jacobs and Mario Cazares Jr. to some degree would stand to benefit more from that than this engagement. Hell, Cazares versus Rosado is more intriguing than Jacobs versus Rosado. I reiterate, it just doesn't make sense for a guy like Daniel Jacobs to be doing the dance with Gabriel Rosado. There's no intrigue in it. I got nothing against the fighters, I don't. But I really hope Matchroom and DAZN reconsider orchestrating this thing, because it just seems to me like a waste of time, a waste of resources. In other news, Mikey Garcia had this to say. He says, Manny Pacquiao is fighting me next 100%, not Conor McGregor. I saw the tweets from McGregor, but I haven't seen any from Pacquiao. Are there any responses from Pacquiao yet? I haven't seen any. Garcia told Fight Hype. Manny Pacquiao's next fight is not Conor McGregor. Manny Pacquiao's next fight is with me, so McGregor has to take a number. McGregor's next fight might be against Manny Pacquiao, but before that, Manny Pacquiao has to fight me first, and that's 100%. In reference to the matchup, Mikey said, how did they do Mayweather-McGregor? It's entertainment, and it's business. So why not, he said. I'll watch it. It's entertainment. Why do people watch WWE? It's entertainment. Why do people watch the really bad fights out there? It's entertainment. Manny Pacquiao's next fight is with me. That's going to happen. Watch. It won't be this year. It'll be next year. To address Mikey Garcia's question as to whether or not there's been any confirmation from the Pacquiao people as far as that Conor McGregor fight, there has been a response, from the Manny Pacquiao offices, from the Manny Pacquiao side of things, that Conor McGregor fight, that is a reality. It could soon become one. It's just a matter of when. It might be exactly how Mikey says it is. When he says that Conor's next fight in all likelihood will be Manny. But as far as Manny's next fight, Manny's next engagement will be with Mikey. It could be that way because if you think about it, that is the ideal pecking order for Manny Pacquiao. Manny hasn't fought in a year. It will have been over a year by the time next year gets here. He will need to sharpen his tools. As a 41-year-old fighter,
Going on 42.
You don't need ring rust ahead of any fight.
You don't.
Any fight or any freak show. So a fight with Mikey Garcia coming before a circus match with Conor McGregor, well, that does make a lot of sense because while Conor's not a boxer, he's a lot bigger guy than Manny Pacquiao. Mikey Garcia is a novice welterweight with only 2 fights under his belt in the division. A loss, a one-sided loss to Errol Spence, and a decision win over Jesse Vargas.
His last fight.
By the time that Mikey Garcia fight rolls around, it will have been over a year's time since Manny Pacquiao locked horns with anybody, so there will be considerable ring rust for Manny to shake off, and Mikey Garcia, more so than any other opponent, would be the ideal candidate for Manny to shake off that ring rust with at minimal risk to him. And what this pecking order essentially communicates is that fights with Terrence Crawford, fights with Errol Spence Jr., rather the winner of Spence Jr. versus Danny Garcia, those fights are off the table. Those fights were never really realistic propositions for me to begin with. The comments that Boo Boy Fernandez and Sean Gibbons made ahead of the Errol Spence Jr. versus Sean Porter unification match told me everything I needed to know about what Team Pacquiao meant to do moving forward. They were strongly against Manny fighting the winner of that fight, and that is evident here in what news is breaking, that Manny's set to fight Conor McGregor at some point, and before that, he might fight Mikey. It's what I always thought it was, that Manny ain't gonna fight Terrence, and he ain't gonna fight Errol Spence Jr., or the winner of Spence Jr. versus Garcia. So fighters holding out on other fights because they think they can get a Pacquiao fight, that's an exercise in futility. That is pure farce.
So you can stop using him as an excuse now.
You can stop using his name as a reason to hold out on other fights. That applies to Errol Spence Jr., that applies to Keith Thurman, that applies to Sean Porter. I've been telling you guys for weeks and months that Mikey Garcia is more likely to land that Pacquiao fight than any one of these other guys.
The same is true here today.
So, a fighter, a champion, a unified champion like Errol Spence can no longer use a Pacquiao fight, even if it is a unification match, as an excuse to keep a Terrence Crawford fight on the back burner when that Pacquiao fight is not there for you, dog.
And it never really was.
And the continued use of Manny Pacquiao's name as a reason to put distance between yourself and your fight with Terrence Crawford would be little more than just a piss-poor excuse.
You're gonna need new material.
As Manny may defend that WBA title one last time against Mikey Garcia, and in all likelihood, he will vacate it as he heads into that Conor McGregor circus fight, whatever you want to call it. And that WBA title could land in the hands of Yordenis Ugas just as easily as it could land in the hands of Virgil Ortiz, as both Yordenis and Virgil hold lesser versions of the title. The WBA could so decide to elevate any one of those two guys to full-fledged world champion in the welterweight division after Manny throws that belt in the air.
Jamal James is interim champion.
He is someone else who's in line as well. The bottom line here is that it's the way I always told you it was. Mikey's likelier to get that fight as far as boxers go. So this entire narrative about how Errol Spence can hold out on fighting Terrence Crawford because he's looking to fight Manny Pacquiao, that's just a lot of hogwash. That's just a waste of time and a piss-poor excuse, as that fight ain't on the table for you, brah.
And it ain't been on the table for a lot of you motherfuckers.
And finally, per tweet from Michael Benson, Andy Ruiz Jr. has revealed that he's set to start training with new coach Eddie Reynoso alongside Canelo Alvarez later today. The former heavyweight champion is beginning camp for a fight early next year and said, "It's a weight loss journey." That's exactly what we're calling it. And, you know, it feels like Andy Ruiz has been set to start training with Eddie for years now. You know, I've been hearing this in repetition for a while. I don't know if you guys have, but I have. And this is going to sound familiar, but Andy Ruiz's problem wasn't his trainer, wasn't Manny Robles. No, wasn't his trainer. It was his ticker. And perhaps Eddie Reynoso is a tad bit more capable of whipping Andy into shape, but for the most part, the bulk of the work really does have to come from Andy, not anybody else. Not Manny Robles and not Eddie Reynoso, as those two guys, they can't do the training for you, and they certainly can't fight for you. Now, can they? Andy Ruiz is being built back up. That's why they're putting him in a low-risk situation with Chris Arreola on a card where Luis Ortiz is set to make an appearance against a low-risk opponent as well. The intention seems to be to build Andy back up so that he can have that fight with Luis Ortiz, a non-title fight. A fight between Andy and Luis, it really isn't a bad engagement. I mean, I think there is some intrigue associated with just such a match, as, you know, Luis Ortiz has only actually ever been beaten by one guy, that guy being the former WBC champion Deontay Wilder.
2 times.
Though one could make the inference that if he's only ever been beaten by one guy, it's because he hasn't fought most of the good fighters at the weight. Luis Ortiz is a fighter who's been around for a long time, and he's never locked horns with a Pulev, a Povetkin, a Marco Huck, a Mike Perez, an Alexander Ustinov.
None of them.
Many of the who's who fighters of the previous era of heavyweights have long since been forgotten, but Luis Ortiz is a fighter that was there for that era, and for the most part, he didn't fight very many, if any, of those who's who fighters. To date, his most notoriable victory is Bryant Jennings, the same Bryant Jennings who was coming off a loss to Vladimir Klitschko less than a year between those two fights, between the Klitschko loss and the Luis Ortiz loss. That is Luis Ortiz's crowning achievement, that he could have been around for as long as he has, having debuted in, 2009, 2010, having never bumped into a Pulev, a Povetkin, or even a Chigav. Hell, a Lucas Brown would have sufficed. That he could have been around as long as he has and never locked horns with those kinds of fighters really puts an asterisk over how much you're supposed to read over Luis Ortiz as an opponent and a victory over him. For Andy Ruiz, I guess it's about as solid a win as any.
If he beats him.
Provided that Luis Ortiz can get himself back into the winner's bracket, as Luis Ortiz hasn't had a fight since he was violently knocked out by Deontay Wilder for the second time.
So he is going to be fighting on Andy's undercard.
Now, originally, it was reported last month that this Andy Ruiz card, this Chris Arreola fight, this was set to go down late this year, late 2020. Now they're talking about staging it in early 2021. That begs the question as to why the change, why the move. I hope you guys aren't thinking of staging this fight as a pay-per-view of some kind. I mean, why are you moving it?
That fight don't belong on pay-per-view.
And that kind of card is not to be confused with the Charlo doubleheader we saw this past weekend on pay-per-view. For the most part, that Charlo doubleheader was value for money. You got two good fights, you got bang for your buck. But Andy Ruiz versus Chris Arreola and Luis Ortiz versus who?
I think they said the guy's name is Scott Alexander.
That ain't pay-per-view worthy. The original reports stated that Luis Ortiz could be returning to action as soon as November 7th on somebody's undercard. Presumably Andy Ruiz's. I think all of that has since changed. Now, I don't know what the pecking order is going to be. I don't really know if Luis Ortiz's next ring appearance is going to be on the undercard of Andy Ruiz's fight next year, or if he's still on track to make an appearance November 7th of this year. But either way, neither Ruiz versus Arreola or Ruiz versus Ortiz belongs on pay-per-view. No, sir.
No fucking way.
You would have to put together one hell of an undercard to justify charging people $80 to see those fights. You'd have to.
Those aren't even title fights.
Well, I don't know if the change in plans has more to do with a lack of fight dates on the part of Fox, on the part of Showtime, that perhaps that's why there's been a change in plans. Perhaps that's why Andy Ruiz's next fight is set to be going down next year, early next year, as opposed to late this year. It could be that way, but what I'm hoping is that these guys don't got the audacity to try and stage Ruiz versus Arreola or Ruiz versus Ortiz as some kind of a pay-per-view.
Better not.
Them fights ain't pay-per-view worthy. I don't give a shit what these fighters made in their previous fights or what the fighters' financial demands are. Ultimately, your demands have to align with your actual market value, what you can generate, not what Anthony Joshua paid you.
Not that.
So much as what you can bring in, because what he paid you has more to do with him and less to do with you.
Yeah, he paid you that because he can afford to pay you that.
You ain't the one that's generating it. In any event, let's see how this all plays out. Let's see what happens.